Welcome back to An Electric Revolution. I'm your host, Henry Sanderson. Did the kidnapping of a solar pioneer in 1909 set back the trajectory of solar power? This week we are talking about the life of George Cove, a Canadian inventor and entrepreneur. Born in Nova Scotia in 1863 or 1864, we're not sure exactly which year, Cove presented his first solar electric generator in 1905 in the Metropole Building in Halifax, Nova Scotia. He then moved to the US to continue work on his solar device. In 1909, he exhibited 4 solar panels on a New York rooftop, which were used to charge lead-acid batteries. This was decades before the first conventional photovoltaic solar panel as we know it today was invented at Bell Labs. Cove intended to use the heat of the sun to generate electricity, a so-called thermoelectric generator, but he may have accidentally created a solar panel that generated electricity via light, the so-called photovoltaic effect, similar to current panels we have today. In October of 1909, Cove was kidnapped. Some reports say his life was threatened if he did not cease work on solar power. His company, Sun Electric Generator Company, collapsed soon afterwards. I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Sugandha Srivastav. She is a lecturer in environmental economics and a senior research associate at the University of Oxford. In 2023, she published a fascinating paper on George Cove, which argued that solar power could have become cheaper than coal at least a decade earlier than it did if Cove's business had succeeded. She argues that in the early 1900s, people were remarkably positive about solar power and its potential, yet that attitude then disappeared for decades. Well, Sugandha, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, great to be here, Henry.
So your paper on George Cove and his early experiment on solar modules is fascinating. I wonder if you could just tell me a bit about what we know about George Cove's life?
Sure. So George Cove was the son of a quote-unquote mechanical genius. His father was from Canada and created a lot of inventions that were used in flour mills across the country, had a type of rocking chair, and was this sort of eccentric character who kept inventing different things. So his father's name was Joseph Cove. And George had a couple of siblings. He grew up at a time when Canada was experiencing change. So the railways were coming about, and it was a time of opportunity and travel and access to new markets. And George, being like his father, was also a very inventive person. So he's most famous as, now that I've sort of brought the story to light about his solar panel invention, but he actually worked on a lot of different things. He worked on tidal energy, how to harness the power of the waves, which is very apt for him because he grew up in an area of Canada close to the Bay of Fundy. And that bay has actually some of the most powerful waves in the world. It's sort of shaped like a funnel where there's a lot of resonance and these waves become very majestic and large. So I think he was inspired by the force of nature. He also he invented a better type of brake for a car. And this invention was actually so great that a rich guy who George Cove was talking to said, "I want to buy this off you. What would you like?" And George said, "I'd like your car, sir." That was the trade that was made. So I think it was a car plus some money. And then eventually the most famous part of George Cove's life was when he demonstrated a solar panel in Halifax. And this, back then you had these kind of trade fairs where different inventors would congregate and demonstrate their new inventions. And you'd have a bunch of investors and curious people gather around. And actually the Halifax demonstration went off particularly well because some American investors were there and they said, "You know what, George? This looks great. Would you like to come to Somerville, Massachusetts and set up a lab and further develop this technology?" And so that's when George Cove migrated to the US. There's so much to his life and story, but let me stop there.
I mean, I also had one of his inventions was an electric piano, right? Or helping to make a piano electric.
Yes. So there was the electric piano attachment, which could help record piano music. And there was also a watch, an electric watch that he did. So, this, like like father, like son, these two individuals were prolific inventors. And if you look at the archival record, there's just so much, often like very quirky newspaper articles being like, George, this inventive genius, he's done it yet again. Here's this electric piano attachment. And there was always a sense of wonder and curiosity with how the reporters and journalists of the time covered his inventions.
And what do we know about solar panels? Because there seems some, at least in my mind, some confusion about whether he was just using the sun's heat to generate electricity or whether he'd actually stumbled upon the photovoltaic effect. I wonder if you could clear that up.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of the science of the photovoltaic effect, I mean, you had some early forays into documenting the photovoltaic effect in the late 1800s by Edmund Becquerel. But really, one of the key breakthroughs in understanding the photovoltaic effect and how it really worked was through Einstein. Yet again, Einstein always pops up. And he published a paper in the early 1900s. I think it was, now I'm forgetting the exact year, but somewhere between 1905 and 1907, which explained actually how this works on a really basic physics level. It was his breakthrough paper. And in fact, if I'm not mistaken, I think Einstein actually got the Nobel Prize for that as opposed to a special relativity. So this now is very interesting because George Cove, if you think about when he was doing solar, it's about the same time Einstein was clarifying the actual physics of how the photovoltaic effect worked. So that's just a long way of saying that in terms of popular understanding, it was extremely limited. I mean, the science just wasn't there yet. And I think George Cove set out to create a thermogenerator. So essentially utilizing these heat differentials to generate energy. And that was something that was very well understood at the time. But the curious thing that seemed to happen is that when he tinkered around with the materials, he found that there was more current than could be explained by the heat differentials alone. And according to some evidence in the archive, this happened rather serendipitously. He sort of left this device outside, the sun shone upon it, and then he started noticing that there's this additional unexplained current. And the way Modern Electric magazine describes it is said that this is something that's unknown to science right now. We're not sure how this is happening. So the assumption here is that he made a thermophotovoltaic generator. It did both. It used the heat differential, but it also tapped into the photovoltaic effect.
And how did it compare to, because Charles Fritz had quite a bit earlier already exhibited his solar panels on a New York rooftop, right?
Oh, no. So I need to correct that. So that is a common misunderstanding. Charles Fritz did not demonstrate any solar panels on the rooftop. And that photo actually belongs to George Cove and has been misattributed. There's a great Bellingcat article that looks into it, but Charles Fritz was actually in the late 1800s. He didn't have a laboratory in New York and he didn't have a commercial endeavor. He was working in a laboratory setting and there was no kind of attempt at all to make rooftop solar panels. So that misattribution actually happens in a great book. It's called 6,000 Years History of the Sun. And I think John Perlin wrote that book, which I love. I've read that. But unfortunately, that one little piece is misattributed. So yeah, just to say, as far as the record goes, it seems like George Cove was the first one to actually commercialize solar and do rooftop demonstrations. And by the way, just to, for your listeners to have utmost clarity on that, that photo, along with all the other catalogs, fit into Cove's story of demonstration in Halifax, a lab in Somerville, Massachusetts, and then eventually, after the lab in Somerville, Massachusetts, the invention was so successful that his investors wanted to take it up further and said, hey, George, come to New York. Let's get you some Wall Street investors, set you up on Maiden Lane. And that demonstration actually was very close to Maiden Lane. So that was Cove. It wasn't Fritz.
And I'll link to the Bellingcat article in the show notes, but they essentially prove that it was him, right? And that he
Yes.
potentially airbrushed out of the picture.
So actually, the article says he wasn't airbrushed. It was just two photos. So there was one with George Cove sitting by the panel, and there was another separate photo taken without him next to the panel. But it's the same rooftop. It's very close to his Maiden Lane laboratory. And essentially, there's no good reason for the misattribution. It's one of those things that happen in academia. It's error carried forward. One person makes the mistake and everyone cites them without looking at the original source, right? So when I did my PhD, it's always like, check the first source. Don't carry forward an error. It happens all the time, Henry. I mean, this is a common story.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So what do we know about his kidnapping that you talk about in your articles?
Yeah, so sort of coming back to his life, I mean, in Somerville, Massachusetts, he went through 3 iterations of this solar panel. His lab in Somerville was powered through this solar panel, and every iteration kind of saw an increase in efficiency, etc. So it went off well, and in 1909, the big breakthrough basically seemed to be happening where he registered this company called Sun Electric Generator Corporation. The media was all over this. There were great articles commenting on how the power from the sun would liberate people from poverty, because there was a sense that actually the whole process of excavation and using fossil fuels is messy. There's so many steps involved. These resources are finite. And remember, the important context is even the electric grid barely existed. It was in its infancy. So this idea of building power lines that crisscross across the country and pipelines and all the infrastructure, before that was built, it was a daunting prospect. And then here is this new startup that's on the block saying, actually, all you need to do is put this on your rooftop and the source would be sun. You don't need to dig it up. It's free. It's not subject to any boom or bust cycle. So it was a very compelling prospect. And so the media was all over this. There was the Sydney Morning Herald, all the way in Australia, they were documenting this. All sorts of news outlets in America. It was an explosion of attention. And this is where the story then takes a very odd turn, because this explosion of attention happened in the spring of 1909. And then by the autumn of the same year, it turns out that George Cove has been kidnapped. And the condition for the kidnapping is give up your solar patent, and in return, you will get something close to $1 million in today's money, $1 million, and a fully furnished house. And there's additional evidence that I uncovered since then, where George Cove's wife was saying that in the months preceding the kidnapping, he'd been getting threatening letters saying, cease working on your invention, or else. And she tried to tell the police about this. Then what transpired is that eventually, we don't know what sort of settlement was reached, but George Cove was released somewhere near Bronx Zoo. And afterwards, his reputation took a further hit. So it was then some kind of smear articles came out saying that, was the Sun Electric Generator always tapping into, quote, Edison wires? Maybe this was never generating any electricity of its own. Maybe it was just using Edison wires. And George Cove's reputation took a big hit after that. He was called the man who claimed he could bottle sunshine, and sort of these, this kind of thing continued. So that was unfortunately the demise of the Sun Electric Generator, and he deregistered his corporation afterwards.
Do we have any evidence that it was due to, either the electric power industry or the, even the oil industry, or do we know at all?
No, so we don't have direct evidence. I mean, there is this article by Dennis Bartels, who's a Canadian scholar at the University of New Brunswick, who was actually one of the first ever to really, I think this is already back in the 70s, he wrote about George Cove. So he's really a pioneer academic. And he actually has this really interesting theory where he speculates that it very well could have been linked to these industries because if you look at the economics, this was going to be a paradigm shift. It would have threatened the entire foundation of the fossil fuel industry because this industry relied on digging and combustion and wires and pipelines. And here there was suddenly a challenger technology that said, you don't need any of it. You don't need to build these big wires. You don't need these pipelines. Like, actually, we can have a new paradigm. And Henry, this really was a new paradigm because George Cove was working on batteries too. I mean, one of his investors who actually declined to invest said, George, I'll be with you as soon as you crack the battery bit. Once you get a better battery, I'm with you, but you need to work on that, George. And so it would have been a different paradigm. It would have questioned the build out of the electric grid, which is something, an endeavor that Edison undertook. So let's put it this way. We at least know which industry would have been threatened because in terms of, the paradigm would have been different. Do we have direct evidence on who would have done this kidnapping? No, I mean, this was a long time ago and George's case was never really investigated by the police. It was kind of open and shut. They thought, well, he's free now. Why go further? Which I think is something his wife took issue with. So there are some records where the wife is like, he was getting threatening letters. Do you sort of want to look into this a bit more?
Fascinating. So the police never brought charges. There was never any further progression on the case.
No, so there was something where, now this, I think this was my interpretation of the documents is that this was part of a smear campaign, but some said that actually George Cove might have staged it himself as a publicity stunt. I find that claim sort of hard to believe given how much publicity he already had. It seems a bit strange to do that. And the others say that maybe his investors might have done it. So at some point, there was this idea that he fell into a bad crowd with investors, with some Wall Street investors trying to artificially manipulate the valuation of Sun Electric Generator to make it seem more valuable than it actually was. And so one other kind of piece of speculation that's out there in the records is, was it these investors who kind of wanted to wrap the entire thing up? So you stage this kidnapping and then you kind of close it down without them being on the line.
I mean, one of the really interesting things you talk about is how the media coverage of solar in 1909 was in a way more positive than it is now.
Can you talk a bit about that?
Right. So one of my favorite quotes from a 1909 media article in a very popular engineering magazine is, "The aeroplane of the future will dart hither, thither. It will be powered with, electricity from some faraway sun electric generator." They were conceptualizing airplanes that were electrically powered through solar. I mean, it feels far more visionary than anything we'd think about today. They also were another sort of interesting difference in journalism was they were exceptionally poetic in how they described it. They're like, the sun is the ultimate font of all energy. It powers our entire world. And it's but obvious for humanity to eventually tap into the sun. I mean, this is what our plants and trees and the whole earth is sun powered. So why shouldn't humanity be sun powered too? They also acknowledge that fossil fuels are just mining ancient sun energy. What else is it but that? So why not go to the source directly? So there's this almost beautiful poetic rendition and this acknowledgement that, well, this is, of course, the ultimate font, and it is the ultimate advancement to tap into that directly. There's also this wonderful quote by Edison himself, of all people, Edison, who says, "Actually, digging and burning is dumb." Those weren't his words, I'm paraphrasing, but there's this wonderful piece where he says that, this is not the enlightened form of energy generation. This is basic. We've been burning things since we were cavemen. But if we crack the problem of harnessing renewables, that feels like the advancement. So I think that there was really this sense, not only in terms of just the superiority of using an infinite source of energy. The fuel source for solar is infinite. It is our sun. but a real respect for the technology, which I think is lacking today. I don't see that of, oh, this is the next big pursuit and we should respect it and it's grandiose and it's visionary. In fact, I see so much hate and skepticism. I'm like, well, guys, digging and burning isn't the most smart paradigm. I'm with Edison on this one. That seems pretty basic to me.
Yeah, no, me too. I couldn't agree. But could we really have gone that route? I mean, you do a calculation, hypothetical calculation, where if we'd started on solar earlier, the cost could have been competitive with coal in the 2000s, which in my mind is an interesting counterfactor, right? Because before China's, coal demand really took off, etc. Can we really say with Cove's technology that could have been a possibility?
Yeah, so basically I'll walk through how I came to this thought experiment. So essentially, one thing that's very interesting about solar plus other technologies is this concept of learning by doing. So the more it's like trial and error. The more you do something, the better you get at it. You make a tweak here and there, and you get the new and improved version. And actually for solar, this isn't just a tale. It's actually something borne out really consistently in the data, whereby with every doubling of solar capacity, you have a 20% decline in the unit cost of electricity that comes from solar. Now, this has been a relationship that's been documented from 1976 to the present day. It's the reason why solar panels became very cheap. And as my colleague Don Farmer would say, this was very predictable. He was one of the few people who back in 2010 said solar is going to be extremely cheap. He made a bet. One of the few people who was actually spot on. He got it right. And this was 2010. Remember, everyone's being a naysayer and pessimism is super cool. So essentially, then I was like, right, we have this relationship. It's backed by the data. Why don't we do the opposite of forecasting? Why don't we backcast this relationship and say, what if solar development just continued from the time of George Cove up to Bell Labs, right? Because after George Cove, there was a hiatus in solar development. No one worked on solar in any substantive way until the 1950s when Bell Lab revisited the idea of solar-based energy. So it's a very simple thing. Then let's just assume that we kept having continual development in solar, no hiatus, and apply that relationship and see what would that additional half a century mean for when solar would come down the cost curve. And that additional half a century means that under very conservative assumptions, solar could have been cheaper than coal. When the Spice Girls were popular, when the Inconvenient Truth came out, that could have been the time when solar would have already had enough cumulative experience that it would have been cheaper. And remember, Henry, the main assumption here, many people say, Sugandha, but you're assuming that George Cove would have sorted it out. I'm like, no. That's a strong assumption. I don't even need that assumption. My assumption is weaker. My assumption is just that it wasn't killed and attacked, that there was no hiatus. It doesn't matter if Cove didn't have the perfect solar cell. The whole point of learning by doing is learning by doing. It's messing up and trying again and again and again. And we already know Cove went through 3 iterations. Those got better. It doesn't even have to be Cove. It could have been someone else who picked up the mantle after that. But the point is not to have that hiatus, that complete, sort of dead end, which is what humanity did experience. Which, by the way, I mean, this is now where I sort of link it to the smear campaign and the complete kind of the bad press that followed. And I think that, as you said, Henry, that is super significant because now we know, for example, we know it's an empirical fact that solar can be cheap, right? That reality has been realized now. And more than 2/3 of the world, solar provides the cheapest electricity. And in fact, it's the cheapest electricity humanity has ever seen. So we know that this is possible. But to have it when the Spice Girls were popular, as you say, that could have been transformative because we know the 2000s were when a lot of countries were building up their economies. They were energy hungry. They were building up their manufacturing base. And India, China, Indonesia, South Africa. I mean, there's so many countries on this list for whom the 2000s were really, really important. If solar had been cheaper then of course humanity always picks the affordable and easy option, right? So I think that that's a really consequential point. And I think the deeper point here is that technology is very endogenous to the decisions we make. We choose what gets better. We choose which paradigm to exist in. And then we put all of our brain power, our best academics to make that work. It's not just something that ticks along outside. It's something we consciously decide. And I say that as someone who works at a university. I see these decisions, right? The battery lab right next door. They're making choices right now on what to support and what to bring down the cost curve. So to just view this as something that ticks along outside the human social system, I don't think is accurate. So that's, I think, the powerful thing about Cove's story. It sort of poignantly illustrates that missed opportunity.
And as you say, it would take until the 1950s until Bell Labs came up with the silicon solar cell. So there's quite a delay. But I guess if there wasn't a conception about the dangers of climate change back in the 1910s,
what would have driven the work on the solar cell? Would it have just been the notion that fossil fuels are inefficient?
The notion that they could run out was actually quite a big concern back then. And much of fossil fuel innovation has been really to address that fear. Like, can we get better at drilling? Can we drill horizontally? Can we do this offshore? Can we go to places that have never been gone before? So fossil fuels don't experience learning by doing because their costs actually get higher, because once you extract them from easy to access places, you need to go offshore. And most of the innovation offsets those increased costs. So the way my colleague Dawn Farmer says it is, it's like a treadmill where you're running to stand still. All the innovation is just trying to offset the increased costs of excavation. This is very different from things that do experience learning by doing, like solar and wind and batteries and chips and processors, because they're very modular. And they don't actually have this excavation element. They don't have an inbuilt increasing costs dimension, which fossil fuels actually inherently do. Hydropower also has that, right? Once you tap water in easy to access places, you need to go to the really difficult to access places. So there's this fundamental fuel dynamic. And I think that's the other thing that one needs to acknowledge here, that really the supply chain and renewables are very easy because the quote unquote fuel is free. You don't need to put it in a tanker. You don't need a pipeline. You can just get that. It's God-given. And so that was also, I think, a source of inspiration for many, that you don't need these complex infrastructure investments because your fuel is abundant and infinite and freely available. So I think, to the point that I was almost saying before, there is this recognition of technological superiority, that this is easy. There's a certain ease within it. And because, you and I are products of the century we live in, we forget how much had to be built to enable the fossil fuel paradigm. There was this liquefaction of gas. That was an innovation. There was the building up pipelines, tankers. I mean, there's so much infrastructure behind this that sometimes I want to pull my hair out when people say fossil fuels are cheap. I'm like, do you know how much we built to support the system? Just because you're born in this decade or this half century, don't forget what costs have been incurred to support this. And the fact that actually prior to those costs being incurred in the early 1900s, people saw value in this other paradigm. And then they thought that it was actually technologically very simple and superior because of the nature of the fuel source. And that was it, Henry. I mean, there was really an acknowledgement of that, which I think we've lost that, right? We can't see the forest from the trees anymore.
And do we know that Cove thought that, or was it just that he was, as you say, a prolific inventor and this was one of his inventions?
No, I think there is a sense that he did think that. I mean, in a lot of the articles and the coverage, and his sort of past sense as well. Like he had this tidal patent, right, to harness the wave energy. There's a sense that he was inspired by the abundant energy that is just free flowing, and in some ways can be tamed, but we haven't tamed it yet. He actually got a medal from the Canadian government for that little hydro-tidal invention of his. So there is this real sense that he is inspired by nature and energy and perceives energy in a different way, is more attuned to the energetic world around us and this abundant free-flowing energy. I think with that said, he was also just very prolific, like any of these types are. Like to me, he seemed a bit of this nerdy academic type who's always tinkering here and there. It's what his father did as well. I can almost picture this household, kind of working away at their different mechanical devices. And it was a time where, you could make it big. I mean, this is the early 1900s, right? So it's like the beginning of this, beginning of capitalism. You had the Gilded Age. You could really take off. But at the same time, also, there was no conception of responsible business conduct, right? If you were the naive scientist who went to Wall Street without your eyes being wide open, then of course you could also get taken advantage of. And, this is the other thing that I think modern listeners or readers forget, but we've come so far with antitrust law, responsible business conduct. I mean, you just have to watch The Current Wars, which is a brilliant movie. It's Nikola Tesla versus Edison, to see what business looked like back then, right? I mean, Nikola Tesla was advocating for the alternating current, brilliant technology. And Edison took the alternating current and invented the electric chair to execute humans using Tesla's technology to freak everyone out. I mean, that's what business practices looked like back then. Wasn't very responsible, I'd say.
Interesting. Well, Sugandha, thanks so much for joining me. That's fascinating to hear about George Cove, one of the, who's been quite forgotten by the history. And it's interesting to hear his story and perhaps what could have been if he hadn't been kidnapped. Thanks for your time.
Thanks for having me, Ian.
Thank you for listening to An Electric Revolution. For the next episode, we'll dive into a story about a company that supplied wind turbines to generate electricity to rural America, right up until the 1950s. If you are enjoying this podcast, please subscribe to be notified about all future episodes. Thanks for the support.